Okay, so we're now going to take a quick look at two of our other data formats, and these are sort of our web-friendlier formats. They're also the formats that we tend to get data from the web delivered in. So for example, the output of APIs, for example, which can be a really valuable data source, those often come in XML or JSON, more typically JSON these days, but we'll see a couple of examples with XML, and just kind of want to illustrate what the relationship is between these two and sort of how they function. First, what I'm going to do though is I'm going to actually look, we're actually going to look at a different data source for this, but I want to point out that very often one finds different things in different formats. So as you're exploring data sources, sometimes it's worth kind of poking around, and I should say it's always worth poking around and kind of seeing what you find. In this case, for example, if I look at the XML, and first of all you notice that XML in my Chrome browser just opens up right in a new browser window. This is actually like a pretty sensible, if we sort of compare it to our layout here, we can see how there's kind of a sensible relationship between this file and actually our comma-separated value, or our Excel file. Obviously it looks very different in a lot of ways, but it has very similar data. So just to point out a few things here, those of you who have experience working on blogs, some element of this should look kind of familiar, mostly because we have these words surrounded by caret braces, or angle brackets, sometimes they're called. And again, as you should know from your reading, this is called an element. And elements are, elements need to be self-contained. So for example, we have, a row element that then has a backslash before its closing element tag. We also have attributes, which is a case where we see something within that element, sort of inside these angle brackets, that it is, has a name, an equal sign, or a value, an equal sign, and then inside quotations, it has a value for that attribute. This format where we have sort of a name for something and then some kind of sort of equation type punctuation, I guess is the word I'm looking for, followed by a value is a very common setup in programming languages and data formats. We're going to see this all over the place. It doesn't always look the same, but it has the same function. And there's a generic term we use to call it a key-value pair. So in this case of attributes, the key is going to be _ID. Obviously, the equal sign is sort of the intermediate, sort of the equation element there. And then this one in quotation marks is the value. So again, we're going to see this in XML. We're going to see this in our parallel JSON. The syntax is a little bit different, i.e., the specific characters that we use on either side. But anytime you hear somebody say, "Oh, it's in key value pairs," that's what they're talking about. So again, we have elements, we have attributes, and if we look at it, we say, okay, row ID equals 1, right? Okay, row ID, so that's the number of the row. We see in here health code. We see health code article number, which yes, corresponds to this. So we actually see a really nice kind of corresponding structure, and we could go through and see how row by row it sort of matches up with what we have in our spreadsheet file. Now on the flip side, I just want to point out that if I look at the JSON file from this document, I get something really different. There's kind of all this stuff. There's this meta tag. It says something about views. So again, we're going to go through and kind of show how these formats can be parallel, but what I want to point out here is actually just that there's very different information encoded in the JSON file output by this, that's sort of attached to this data source than what has been appearing in our other formats. This can be a good thing or a bad thing. It really, this actually I think is a little bit more onerous the way it's organized. I'm at a loss to really describe this looks like it came out of a database in some way. Much less useful, I think, if we come down here where we see this data element, then we start to see something that looks vaguely, but only very vaguely similar, where we see, okay, here's short title and general provisions, I recognize that, I recognize this value here, there's a null at the end, I don't know what that's about. So it's just to say that, in the case where you have a data source that offers things in a lot of different formats, take a look around, especially if you're not finding what you want in one or the other of the formats. And again, that's why this is important to have literacy among these different things, because you almost never know what you're going to find. And there's been many cases, I've had some in my personal experience, and there's many well-known cases where information that was allegedly not available was actually hidden in the hidden rows of the Excel spreadsheet or something like that. So it's worth eyeballing this stuff and kind of digging a little bit if you don't find what you're looking for right away. Okay, so now we're going to move on to looking at an alternative data source. We're actually not going to use this as our XML and JSON example. Rather, we're going to look for some additional data. And in this case, I thought it would be interesting. We're going to bleed a little bit into next week's topics, but there are some really useful skills in sort of finding information on the web beyond looking at existing databases. One of the things we can look at is sort of look at web pages another way. And so I actually thought it would be interesting to get information about the locations of some of the stores. So that database that we're going to be using has information about a bunch of different, quite a lot of different grocery store chains. And I thought, okay, well, it would be good to find out where they are. So I just did a Google search for Trader Joe's. I'm coming up with this information, and I see here on the right-hand side, there's a listing of the Trader Joe's locations. And obviously, again, this isn't a web page, right? Which is a good browsing format, but not great for our data access. So I'm going to use a little trick here. You may notice that I'm using Chrome. Actually, it may not be visible to you, but I'm using Chrome. And what Chrome has is a set of inspection tools built into the browser that let us see kind of the guts behind, the structure behind the web page. And so I can access this just by doing a right click and choosing Inspect Element. Now, what this is going to show me is kind of what's inside this particular element. And again, you don't need to worry about sort of the guts of what we're looking at here, but I'm actually going to use a different thing. Very often, I think I mentioned that XML and JSON are both formats that are commonly used to kind of store and deliver information over the web. And what I'm going to use is the so-called network tab of that pops up. So when I do that inspect element, I end up on this elements tab of Chrome. If I flip over here, I'm on the network tab. So if I reload my page, what this is going to do is it's going to tell me all of the files that are being loaded by this web page in order to render itself. And we can see as we look at it that there's going to be a lot of, so you see there's type here, there's going to be a lot of images. So I see PNG images, I see GIF images, I see text in JavaScript, I see text plain, a lot of different things going on here. And what I can do once this is rendered, and you don't always know if this is going to work out, right? I looked around actually at a bunch of, sort of the magic of the internet. I looked around at a bunch of grocery store websites for this type of information. But it's worth, again, it can be an option. It can be something that yields data for you, especially if there's no other way to find it. And towards the end of the module, we're going to be looking at other ways that we can access relatively inaccessible data. But for here, what I'm going to look for is, I'm going to look for things that are basically in text, whose type is sort of text or HTML or XML, something that is a data format, right? So JavaScript is a scripting format. Image formats are obviously image formats, and I want something that's a little bit more vanilla and not CSS, because CSS again is cascading style sheets. So I'm going to keep going down here, and so now I'm going to start to see, okay, text HTML, text JavaScript. I kind of look a little bit further here. What do I find? Aha! So I have a couple here that say text XML. So I can go ahead and say open link in new tab. So I just did a right click there. And what do you know? I have all of this information. And interestingly, again, this is a format that has more information. Well, maybe not too much more, but it has at least all of the information, sometimes more information, than is readily available in that spreadsheet, than in the HTML view. So I can actually take this, and again, we know that this is XML because essentially the organization. You notice that when I open in my web browser, I can kind of expand and collapse elements here. So XML has a symmetrical format where the last open first close. So if I open name, I need to close name again, you know, I need to make sure that it's a parallel, sort of like a little Venn diagram. That everything is contained there. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to take a look at how we might convert, and so I'm going to do actually a view page source on this again. It's a right click, context click, and I'm going to select this, I'm going to copy it down, and I am going to put it into, actually I'm not going to put it into App Canvas Studio 3. We're not going to worry about software yet. Again, because XML and JSON are both text formats. So what we're going to do is just look at how we might convert this to JSON. So JSON can support all of the things that XML can support, but the reason why it became more popular, XML was a specification, stands for Extensible Markup Language. It is a superset of HTML. You get to make up what the little tags are, whereas obviously in HTML, you know, you're kind of stuck with the P and the B and the, you know, header one and all of that stuff that you might be familiar with from working on blogs. With XML, you can choose what the names are, which allows it to be descriptive. So the helpful thing about XML is it can tell us something about the data it contains. You know, does this Trader Joe's sell beer? No. You know, that would be, that was kind of the purpose of XML. You wouldn't be able to indicate that with HTML tags. At the same time, though, we end up with a lot of extra text in an XML file, because whatever we name something, we have to open and close it with the same text. And that gets to be verbose, right? Wordy, lots of words, more than we would like, especially if we're dealing with larger data sets. On top of that, you know, at the time that XML came into common usage, basically, you know, the technologies of the internet were, there was a lot of Flash, there was a lot of CSX and sort of XSLT, which is not worth thinking about, but anyway, you know, the point being that this was a way to store information and then let things like, for example, in the days of Google Reader and RSS Reader, which is itself another specification of XML, to allow people to write applications that could format this data however they wanted, right? Because it wasn't really the format that was important, it was getting the data out there. So that was all well and good, except that, you know, these days the most dominant language on the internet, the most dominant scripting language really is JavaScript. And JavaScript doesn't love XML. It's awkward to try to parse XML with JavaScript. You had to write a lot of extra code in order to do it, and so at some point, not all that long ago, although this is that was several years, it was proposed to create a JavaScript object notation, also known as JSON, J-S-O-N, which basically would provide this kind of custom structured data organization that XML could provide, but without, but in a more concise format, and also that would play better with JavaScript, basically. So what we're going to look at here is we're going to create a JSON file that mimics the content, that contains all the same content, well, not all of it, we're going to sort of subselect from this list, but see how these two formats are parallel. So all you're going to need to do here is open up, I'm going to sort of squish this up here, and I'm just going to open up a text edit file, because again, these are all text formats. I don't need special software to deal with them. Software can be helpful, and we'll talk about how and why. But basically all we need to do is have a text file open on one side, we have our XML on the other side, and when you come back in a minute, we will look at how to essentially convert this XML into JSON, just to give you an idea of how the structures can be paralleled.